All right. Welcome back to the Scholar and Gentleman and living rooms around the country, where we are talking about the Grand Inquisitor section. Is it book 5, part 2, I think, of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. This is our memorial reading group in memoriam to our dearly departed friend, Chris Herron, and special memory tonight, memory eternal to our friend Ann Zimmerman, who just passed away this week. So it's a kind of a heavy-hearted discussion, and it's a heavy chapter, kind of intense material. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys make of this chapter, because I've always found this to be a riddle. Alyosha says Ivan is a riddle, and I'm always trying to figure out what does he think, what does he believe. This chapter, for all its infamy and being anthologized in all sorts of literary textbooks and stuff, is not very straightforward, and it's hard to understand exactly what Ivan is driving at. So we're coming off Rebellion, which is a very easy to understand basic outcry of the heart against injustice and human suffering in the world. That makes a lot of sense. It's very candid. We kind of reached the end of that book with Alyosha bringing up Jesus Christ, that there is someone who can forgive all on behalf of all and who has voluntarily, made a sacrifice for the world. And Ivan says, "Oh, I'm glad you brought that up, because I've got something to say about that." I think that there are a lot of parallels between this chapter and the earlier chapter where we learn about Ivan's treatise that he's been writing about the ecclesiastical courts, and something we can examine a little bit more. But what I find particularly similar is that I feel like a lot of people read it and take it a lot of different ways and all think that he's on their side. So I'm curious, before we dive in deep, if you guys want to throw out there your nutshell version of what Ivan is driving at. What is the point of this Grand Inquisitor poem?
That humans can't handle freedom, or that I wasn't sure if it's that they all can't, or some by nature don't have the ability to be responsible for choosing. And I thought of a lot of stuff, like dictators, religious or otherwise, fascism, a lot of totalitarian, but like totalitarian ideas, in terms of like legalism and how it is that one can choose to make others happy by subjecting them to their will. Kind of classist, almost eugenic or something.
Yeah, I think Aaron's right. I always thought the summary of Ivan's argument was quoted when he said, "Had you loved man more, you would have expected, or you would have trusted him less." Or I forgot the exact quote, but you would have burdened him less. You would not have asked so much of him. I think that's the general emotional thrust of it.
I also got a strong sense that in the Grand Inquisitor, talking to and disagreeing with this Christ figure, a very strong sense of the fact that when religion becomes an institution, and often the more powerful any institution becomes, the more it strays from and even directly contradicts the original teachings of Jesus. Thought that was very, very strong.
Okay, so I have some questions. I appreciate if you, you know, putting your foot out there and diving in here to the deep end. But some questions, maybe get some conversation going. Is Grand Inquisitor in some way a continuation or further development of the points made in Rebellion, or something different entirely? There's one question. And the other question is, this is what I really have a hard time making up my mind on, is this all said with a smirk ironically, or is this Ivan's kind of prescription for, all right, in light of the situation we find ourselves in Rebellion, this is actually the best plan for humankind? So is it serious? Is it ironic? Is it a critique of totalitarian power? Or is it saying the opposite? And again, is this a continuation of the Rebellion argument in some way? So two questions you can pick up on there.
I would say it's a continuation in a way that it would prescribe blocking the criticism of rebellion, of the cruelty. You know, to have a framework that mitigates cruelty would be this sort of legalism where the Inquisitor has replaced Christ with this notion that we'll give them their needs, we'll make their moral decisions, and we'll provide homogeneity. And in that way, I think that's paraphrasing the temptations he was talking about. And in that way, it would be a continuation. Maybe a response to that criticism is precluding humans from having choice.
Well, McGee, I had never... Can you hear me? Okay. I had never thought of this until you phrased it that way, but I mean, we ended with that idea that we've been tracing throughout the novel, on behalf of all and for all, right? This idea of like responsibility to each other, but also like Christ being the one that comes and takes all those sins on for us. And I feel like the Grand Inquisitor is being held up as this person. It's like a twisted version of that idea. He will take on all our responsibility for us. Like, that's where, to me, it also seems to be intersecting with like existential ideas, right? Like freedom is too burdensome, it's too difficult, it's going to crush most people, and therefore he's taking it on for all of us. So that does seem like a continuation in some ways to me.
As far as the existentialist thing goes, like Jesus is the existentialist here, because he's the one saying that you have the power to choose. Like, humans have existence, and they can choose their essence by either electing into him or not. Right? So if essence is determined for them by an outside force, all they need is faith in God, which the Inquisitor is taking in place of Christ. He's saying that he gives that essence. So no one has to choose because it's too much. That's like anti-existentialist. That's like the opposite of what, like, I'm not an expert at it, but I would say the opposite of what Kierkegaard had said, and the opposite of who was theistic, and the opposite of what Sartre said, where, you know, choosing in and choosing to live responsibly is like the greatest way to live.
We're having a lot of shuffling and page turning noises. If you're not talking, can you please mute your microphone until you think you're about to talk, and then we'll have less flashing around in the recording and kind of craziness. I'm not going to intervene in any of their comments, so if someone else wants to chime in right now, I'm saving mine for a minute.
I mean, the flip side of the existentialism thing is that the, sorry, I think my cat is causing some of the shuffling, is, God damn it, shove off, is that the Grand Inquisitor and the, you know, the church in this instance, I mean, one of the other paramount things in an existentialist framework is, you know, embracing the world as it is, and then sort of trying to put values into it. And so what they are doing in a sort of twisted way is, you know, it's it is trying to put meaning into the world, or make make the world make sense. It almost, you know, it reminds me of like a bad, not a bad, maybe bad, of a common easy reading of Nietzsche, where the point is like to only a few special people can really understand the truth, and they are going to be the ones who make the decisions for everybody else. And the fact that there is no alternative set of values makes that okay. That's a pretty common facile-ish existentialist thing. One of the things I was confused about as I read this, in terms of like how seriously to take Ivan, to go back to McGee's other question, is, so like there are all these layers of, you know, like Ivan's telling this story, and it's a story that he never even really wrote, and it's also set in the 15th century, and also the Grand Inquisitor is talking, it sometimes seems like he's talking about the way things actually are, and it sometimes seems like he's talking about how he thinks things are going to be in the future. And there's, among the other things that Ivan could be doing, is he just describing what he thinks that the church is now? Aside from, you know, how it should be, or, you know, the appropriate way to behave in a godless world?
I'm going to chime in with some thoughts, not responding exactly directly to that, but I think so much depends, how you read this depends so much on whether you think Ivan is actually wrestling with any sort of question about whether God exists or not, and is actually possibly angry or upset at a God if a God does exist, or if you read it as he's an outright atheist who's already settled that question. I think that completely changes the reading. And I'm going to offer the lens of, okay, if he is wrestling theologically, then this chapter could definitely be seen as a continuation of the arguments he began in Rebellion, which were basically like, I don't accept this world and I return my ticket, because I can't accept even any sort of final harmony if it tolerates a middle portion of history in which people suffer and are tormented. And this would be, the great sort of classical theological defense for the problem of evil. Why is the world full of evil? Is because God wanted to create free beings, who had the capacity to love and to form themselves into something greater and become more like God. But in order for that to be possible, they also had to be able to choose the opposite. And that God sort of permits but does not desire all this mess in order to preserve human freedom. So that's kind of the only real classical theological defense you get for the existence of suffering and evil, and why would a good God tolerate this? So if that's the background somewhere, this chapter could be seen as a devastating blow to that kind of defense. Like, I think here Ivan zooms in on human freedom, and I think he points out a kind of what's the right word? Not disparity, but there's something wrong with the nature we find ourselves created with, which is weak and so easily prone to choosing terrible, destructive things. And this whole plan of salvation for the few who are able to figure it out. So it's a real anger, perhaps, that God would prefer, because he so highly values freedom, that most fall along the path to damnation, but his special sort of super elite, ultra athlete few, make the cut, and he's really proud of them. And so in this scenario, essentially, Ivan is siding with Satan. You have sort of the good, the satanic hero kind of thing here, where in this scenario, Satan is actually the good guy. Like, hey, look, I understand your lot. This is messed up. Like, you got this freedom that you can't handle. It weighs on you. Like, you weren't created with a decent enough strength of nature to actually make good choices, and you live in torment all the time. So look, I have mercy on everyone. Let's just get rid of that. We'll make this easy. We'll make sure everyone gets fed. We'll tell you it's okay. We'll make up games, and at least you won't suffer in the middle section anymore. Is there a God? I don't know, but at least this middle part, it's kind of middle fingers to God, and I'll take over from here because you're doing such a terrible job. And I can imagine, this is sort of, in some sense, maybe the Grand Inquisitor returning his ticket and how he plays that out. So that's kind of one possible way of viewing it. But I think that really only makes sense if Ivan is actually somewhat still wrestling with whether he can believe in God or not. Because if he already doesn't, then what is the point of this whole thing? At least if you're going to interpret even somewhat earnestly. But I'm giving him a little bit of earnest reading here, where I think this is partly his compassion for humanity playing out. I think what's really strange is, just like Ivan prefaces his whole rebellion chapter with the statement that he doesn't really believe or understand how it's possible to love your neighbor. Here we have the beginning of the Grand Inquisitor and his compassionate plan for all of humanity, which begins by burning 100 heretics the day before, possibly because, maybe they're getting in the way of the plan for humankind's greater good or whatever. I don't know. But I have to say, whether or not this is Ivan's reading, it's a reading I'm highly sympathetic to. I, certainly am asking and wrestling with these questions, trying to be a Christian, trying to believe in a good God. And one of the things that I always come down to is this freedom thing. It seems like it's out of sync with yeah, like God maybe has too high a view of us. Our freedom, seems to be something wrong with our hearts and our nature where it seems Herculean to make good and loving choices and just all too easy to be, angry and hateful. And a few people seem to manage, but why just the few, So yeah, there are saints, but what does it matter if 144,000 are saved out of the 1,000 billions or whatever, like he says, congratulations, God, you have your super athletes. So that's one possible reading that I imagine. Which I would guess I would summarize as sort of the devastating critique of the freedom escape from problem of evil, like freedom is a problem.
It reminds, there's a clip in South Park of heaven and the population is like 16,000. And then they flash to hell and the population counter is spinning in the billions. Reminds me of that.
Well, and that's another reason why I think it is a continuation of rebellion, right? Like in rebellion, we didn't just get this picture of the absolutely horrifying things that happen to children. We constantly were being reminded that people are all too prone to choose that, right? That was something we brought up last week, that Yvonne's point isn't just, look, some people out there do these horrible things. It's like this recognition that every one of us is capable of doing really horrible things. And so that's to me where this is sort of, I just thought that it's a follow-up on that point too. Like he isn't just saying, he's saying it's so hard for all of us. Anyway, sorry, I'm not very coherent tonight. I'm very tired.
Is Yvonne even trying to solve anything here? Like, or is he just like making the other counterpoint? Like, all right, so if God's like free and values freedom and loves everyone, and this allows suffering, and then, well, what if we like changed it and took it upon ourselves and limit our freedom? Then it also involves like suffering and burning heretics at the stake, and like that's not a good solution either. So I'm kind of stuck. Is Yvonne stuck here, or is he like? Because it seems kind of strange that he would advocate for, after railing against suffering so much, he's going to advocate for burning heretics at the stake in order to limit freedom in some other way.
I think he was saying maybe that to deal with the suffering problem, you have to eliminate choice, and that doesn't fix the problem. More suffering. And that doesn't fix the problem.
Right.
I think it's incredibly profound. I mean, first of all, thank you to McGee for that really concise summary. But I think that, I don't know, reading it again, and I don't know how many times I've read this, but I've had to read it a bunch. But this is like the first time I've read it in a long time where I wasn't reading it for a particular class purpose. And I just couldn't help but think how prophetic it is. And to think, I mean, how much of, especially you look at the dystopian fiction out there, where essentially it begins with people are trying to solve all the problems of the world, and in so doing are trying to change or limit freedom or human nature and the disastrous consequences thereof. And for me, because I always had read before this passage as a continuation of rebellion and in a certain way of letting maybe Jesus to have his silent say, I never, when McGee began by saying, it's important to think maybe Yvonne really is an atheist and this is just all kind of an artful whatever. And when I had thought about that suggestion, it made me see the reading in a whole new way. Because even though normally when I think about this, I think of it from a more Christian perspective, and I see it as something incredibly beautiful and profound. The idea that Ivan might also be saying maybe human nature is just broken and there's nothing you can do about it, and then him just kind of laughing fiendishly, realizing it's an inescapable problem. Because the thing is, if that is Ivan's point, if it's not a theodicy response, then it does seem to be saying like he's writing from a position of a despair where there really is nothing you can do about it. I don't know. And so for me, I'm struck because when I first read it as a much younger person, like 15 years ago, and someone had told me that the Grand Inquisitor was an argument against Christ, and I read it the first time, I thought that was nonsense. I was like, what are you talking about? This is like one of the most brilliant defenses to the problem of evil I have ever read. But to read it again and for the first time see that maybe it's a despair of maybe human nature is broken and there's just nothing you could do about it. I don't know. I'm just amazed at how you can read something 10 times and yet find more and more levels and layers to it. And so I think I'm going to be a little bit more quiet during this discussion, not because I have less to say, but just because I'm finding myself more and more in awe of this reading.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up like dystopian future fiction, because I definitely see that parallel. But also, when I was reading this this week, kind of saw the parallel to like a communist government, in recent history, not just dystopian future. And the whole idea, and what has always struck me as being really strange about communism, is whenever I read about the theory, it sounds like the best idea ever. And then I look at any time that anybody's actually tried to implement it, and it's turned so opposite and totalitarian and so not good. It's this big contradiction. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing here, like the problem of freedom. Yes, you can say freedom's a problem, but what about the alternative? The alternatives all have problems too. And that's what really strikes me about this.
The other ones have way, 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 way bigger problems. Like if fascism or statism or any of the other isms where there's less choice, it's all been way worse than the flawed system we have based on choice.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you guys have brought this subject up, because I think that's one of the things that comes up a lot. Is this was sort of a rather prophetic insight into the turmoil of the next century. Movements of communism and fascism and all this sort of thing. I think what's pretty interesting to think about, this whole chapter is kind of an inversion of the the gospel. It's kind of an inversion, like Satan's the good guy, God's the bad guy. Oh shoot, I lost my train of thought. It's a rejection of the divine order that's supposed to lead to some sort of, final cosmic harmony. And in its place, it will construct a temporal, passing, sort of imposed, top-down paradise on earth. And there have been numerous times in the book already where they've brought up the idea of socialism and kind of mentioned the questions about God and the question about socialism are the same question from two different ends. And I think there's a little bit of that approaching this from the other end, the socialist dream of a utopian earthly paradise, which the Grand Inquisitor is going to, make way for. To some extent, whether people want it or not, but maybe not. I feel like we're supposed to be sympathetic with the Grand Inquisitor. Maybe you can disagree with that. But what I'm trying to drive at here is it's interesting how this is so much kind of a upside down reflection of Christian aspirations in a real warped way. And you see it in several different places. I made a note on one page where the portrait we're given of sort of how the cognoscenti, those in the know who are taking this burden upon themselves. There is no God, but they know that, but they're going to, lie to the masses for their own good and keep them happy. There's this whole passage that reminded me a lot of but in its most warped form. If you remember early on when we first learned about elders, there's kind of this back and forth debate on, is this a good thing? Is this some kind of crazy power grab, to have complete authority over other people who you freely surrender your will to? There's clearly a theme that is raised in the elder section that's also being discussed here. And here's the part that really reminded me of an elder. We will allow them to sin because we love them. And as for the punishment for these sins, very well, we take it upon ourselves. And we will take it upon ourselves, and they will adore us as benefactors who have borne their sins before God. And they will have no secrets from us. This reminds me of the daily confession that, in front of everybody that you have to do to an elder. We will allow or forbid them to live with their wives and mistresses, to have or not to have children, all depending on their obedience, and they will submit to us gladly and joyfully. The most tormenting secrets of their conscience, all they will bring to us, and we will decide all things, and they will joyfully believe our decision, because it will deliver them from their great care and their present terrible torments of personal and free decision. And then everyone will be happy, and all the millions of creatures, except for the 100,000 of those who govern them. What's remarkable is that's really parallel language to the idea of an elder, but now it's in this really warped sort of view. I sometimes think what the Grand Inquisitor here is describing, sort of the dream he has, seems like he would be completely happy if the Matrix were the real situation. Like if you can just put people in a dream state, give them, a fun life, and secretly they're just a battery, until they die, and then they just disappear. That's kind of like perfect.
I'm glad you connected it to the Matrix, because I agree with you about the elder language, but I also wanted to be cautious because I feel like that might let too many of us off the hook. I feel like one of the points the Grand Inquisitor is making here is how much so many of us want to hand over our freedom to someone or something. And for him, it's not just like, oh, people want an elder, or people want, I feel like the Grand Inquisitor is supposed to be like crazy Pope or something, like some insane version of the Pope here. But it's like they want certainty. They want a clear path. They want answers. And if you can give them that and make them then be a battery in a machine, or like a cog in a machine, they'll be absolutely fine. And that's the point where, to me, this starts to feel so brilliant, is I think that's so many people in our present day and age that are willing to hand over. Like, I feel like so often we can be like, we're Americans, we care about freedom, but it's like, what is our voter turnout rate right now, right? Like, how much have we wanted to hand over our lives and just be happy sitting somewhere and let someone else make the decisions? And I was saying this in the car on the way to church, so McGee's already heard this. Like, I also do see parallels to Christianity in modern America, which is trying to give us this narrative of like, oh, if you just pray the right prayers, you're going to have prosperity and money and a big car and a job and a house and all these answers. Like, I don't know. I guess one of my points is just, there are moments I'm sympathetic to the Grand Inquisitor, but also in the critiques that I think we see here, I'm sympathetic to that it's like, dang, this is us. Like, we find so many ways to try and get out of our freedom. Like, if freedom in this existential sense we're talking about is trying to find meaning in life and make good choices, like so many of us are just like, no, I need to find a way to just like do the bare minimum, get on with my life, not, I don't know. I'm just saying that to me feels like one of the strong indictments that this chapter makes you think is like, what are the ways I try to hang up my freedom? Because I think we all do. It would be nice not to have to worry all the time. That'd be cool.
I think
This is fascinating because while both McGee and Melissa were talking, I had about 4 things that I wanted to jump in and say, and I didn't want to interrupt, but then somehow connected, like there were these separate thoughts that now somehow are like all related. So now I have to try and convey it in some way that makes sense. But I think, first, I'm super glad you brought up the parallels to the elders, because I completely noticed that and was going to bring up that when earlier in the book they were discussing the elders and the idea of giving up freedom to an elder, I'm not 100% sure if I completely understood or agreed with it, but I felt like I was a lot more sympathetic to that idea, to that kind of personal one-on-one connection, religious choice of a person choosing to obey an elder. But then here, when the Grand Inquisitor is talking about some of the same ideas, but for everybody in the world, I'm much less sympathetic to that idea. That seems like weird totalitarian dystopian control. And I think something that also popped into my head somewhere is a conversation I had with my sister, but I'm sure I've had it with other people at other times, about the talking about, capitalism and communism and tribalism and all the different isms, how most of it can work on a small scale with a small group of people, but anything you try to apply globally or even a country as big as the United States is going to fall apart. And then as I was thinking about that kind of tied into what I had mentioned at the beginning, that as religions get big and turned into huge institutions and turn into trying to gain power, they stray from their original message, which seems to be universal. And another thing that really struck me that the Grand Inquisitor talked about was the idea that we want things to be universal. Like, we as humans want to take something that works on an individual personal scale or in a small group and apply it to everybody. And that's where it always gets messed up. So I know I just threw out a whole lot, but it's just like fascinating.
A couple of points to those things. I found you're talking about the elder thing and the Grand Inquisitor maybe standing in for him. I was thinking earlier in the book that the elder kissed Mitya, and then Jesus kissed the Grand Inquisitor. That flips that dynamic. I don't know what to make of that, but you talking about that just set that off in me. And I think also responding kind of to what Jenny said and to what Melissa said, and what McGee said, I find the Grand Inquisitor and the people under his control both pitiable and contemptible. I mean, that's the human condition. The Grand Inquisitor is dealing with feeling like a faith or a God has abandoned him and left him with a mess. And those are people who they're saying can't make choices, but the fact is that, and this is what Jenny was alluding to, is that people are choosers. We have choice. The systems that fail the least are the ones that give people choice. It's just the fact that, our choices can cause destruction, but when you give people a lack of choice, that's when millions and millions and millions of more people starve and die and have horrible outcomes.
Ooh, and one other thing that I forgot to add in my long litany of things I was thinking about is when McGee was talking about the Grand Inquisitor trying to create this paradise on Earth, I just wanted to yell in the middle of his sentence, yes, but paradise for who? Clearly not the 100 heretics you just burned. So I think that the more of a paradise you try to make by limiting choices, the more you're limiting who can be part of that paradise.
Which again raises the questions of Yvonne's intentions by telling this parable poem thing, you know, is he sympathetic to the Grand Inquisitor's plan, or is that a critique of, as someone said earlier, you know, the religious situation already, or I don't know. It seems to me that he gets pretty excited about this idea. That's clear. I want to point out an interesting phrase that helps at least color my impression of this whole tale. This comes on 261 after Alyosha has this sort of, I've been listening patiently in this giant outburst of like, but, you know, like, that's all crazy and stuff. You know, Yvonne paints this nice picture of the old Inquisitor who's living in suffering, knowing the truth, you know, who gave up his life in the desert where he was one of the ones who was able to, you know, he had the strength to live in the freedom, but he gave it up and all that. And then he returns and joins the intelligent people, whoever those are. Alyosha's like, well, whom did he join? What intelligent people? You know, they don't have any great mysteries and secrets except maybe for godlessness. That's their whole secret. Your Inquisitor doesn't even believe in God. That's his whole secret. And Yvonne says, what of it? At last you've understood. Yes, indeed, that alone is the whole secret. But is it not suffering, if only for such a man as he, who has wasted his whole life on a great deed in the wilderness? And here's the very interesting phrase. And still has not been cured of his love for mankind. I found that to be a pretty like striking phrase after this whole thing. Has not been cured of his love for mankind. You know, especially with the sort of framing of this whole discussion about whether love for neighbor is possible. You know, you can raise the question here. If you read this in a sort of godless way, assume Yvonne is an atheist, and this is all a big joke. You know, maybe those who know understand, like, maybe there's some element of this that there are those who, like, maybe we're going to try to do the best we can for all of humanity, but humanity is basically contemptible, and we can do whatever we want. So who cares about the 100 heretics? You know, they were in the way of a greater cause, so we just crush them. You know, and you don't even have to go this way if you don't want to. Like, do whatever you want. There is no God. Yvonne, he's a mystery to me because he's always seems to say three contradicting things at the same time.
Well, that's where me I don't is just some theoretical socialist figure. I also feel like there is a critique of religion inherent in here because those ideas connect, right? Like, how many versions of religion in pursuit of certainty have actual kind? And I know many of us that have been as humanists in the 20th and 21st century, like, one of the questions that came up was so many people feel excluded, so many people feel hurt, so many people have been persecuted, so they leave the church. But also, even if you don't even go that far, like, there are so many versions of even Christianity that have become outright hateful, right? That are just like, we're going to, in pursuit of certainty, because I need things to be certain, I'm not going to deal with the contingency or uncomfortability of living with the plurality that's being described here, right? Like, there's one true way, everyone else can just die. And sure, it's not burning heretics, but that's still a driving force in so many versions of religion. And so that's where I feel like there is a way to have a really certain, like, 100% religion is not to really care about other people, right? Like that was one of the things that has tormented me since I was a young child. Like if you care at all about humanity, it should bother you. The idea of hell should bother you. The idea of eternal torment should bother you. And the idea of like, well, those infidels or non-believers or whatever can just go whatever. It should bother you. So I feel like that to me is where I see Yvonne is really wrestling with something. Like maybe I was a weird kid, but from the time I was a kid, the idea that 12,000 would be saved and billions would die seemed pretty messed up, right? And so I feel like that's one of the tensions this book is often exploring. Like it's hard to love humanity in person. It's easy to love them in the abstract. And Christianity seems to offer an in-person way of loving people until it doesn't. And I think all of us have seen some versions of religion where that has turned into hatred of other people rather than genuine love. And that bothers. To me, that's always where I feel the point like that Father Zosima makes when like there's lots of very good, loving atheists, right? He's saying, even in the 19th century, even at that point, he's saying in this day and age, many people who care have been genuinely driven away from the church for real reasons. And they might still deeply care about humanity.
Okay, I'm going to jump in immediately just to ask with a real petty question. Could all of you hear that whole thing? Because that was really like sparse and interrupted for me. Did you guys get that as a clear connection?
I missed the first 15 seconds or so.
Yeah, I had a couple choppy parts in the middle, but I caught most of it, enough to get the gist.
Sorry, I've like tried to reconnect 5 times. I don't know what's going on tonight.
Melissa, you need to turn off your video and just switch to audio.
Okay.
Yeah, we're definitely having some connection problems. So sorry about that. Our internet sucks at this place. I thought it's always tough because Melissa, when she gets going, is like it's really rapid fire and it's so many ideas, and I don't want to interrupt. But I was having trouble hearing some of it, and I'm in the next room. So now, having said that, please respond. If you want to.
Well, I guess one of the things that really jumped out at me is when Melissa was talking. I mean, McGee, you're bringing up your question of, is Yvonne struggling with these big theological ideas and whether or not he believes in God, or has he already decided he doesn't believe in God and it's just an intellectual exercise? And I think that might be a false dichotomy. I mean, whether or not he's an atheist, I think he's questioning a lot of things about humanity, whether or not he's questioning about God. Like, I think that there are still a lot of big questions going on and struggles.
Absolutely. I'm just always trying to get a read on Yvonne's heart, and occasionally he gives us glimpses, and I think this chapter is particularly hard to know which way to take it. I mean, you know, because is he sympathetic to the Grand Inquisitor? And you know, that's somewhat easy. I'm sympathetic to the Grand Inquisitor in the sort of middle finger to God for freedom and this whole mess of sin and suffering and humans tormenting each other and all that kind of thing. But I think the picture changes if he already doesn't believe in God, and then it's either way. He's definitely like saying a lot about human nature. And those are definitely questions worth talking about either way. But, you know, again, it's how sympathetic is he to this idea of the Grand Inquisitor? Sort of, we need to get rid of the problem of freedom and placate people so they can not be miserable. Melissa and I did have a conversation in the car today, and this is one of the things that I'm not sure, but maybe she and I disagree on. I don't think Yvonne is critiquing religion here, or is critiquing, like, my personal read on this is Yvonne is sympathetic to this whole idea. that he is sort of, in light of his low view of human nature, believes that people can't be trusted with freedom, and you know, the compassionate response of those who have figured the whole thing out is to try to come up with a way to mitigate and reduce suffering as much as possible. Part of the reason I draw that conclusion goes back to the earlier chapters referred to, where he had his treatise about ecclesiastical courts, which was baffling and mystifying people. And there's a statement in there that his ultimate conclusion in that chapter was that the state must become the church. I tend to view the Grand Inquisitor as his more developed later expression of that idea. Here is what happens when the state becomes the church. Like, the state can't actually regulate people by means of, you know, just threatening and enforcing things and normal government laws. But if it instead takes on the mantle of giving people mystery, miracle, and authority, like basically Rome has the real model for how to rule people figured out. And that's what the state should try to do, is to create this kind of, we know better, but tell them a lie so they believe it, are happy. And, you know, you do that by sort of pseudo-religious means. And, you know, this is certainly something we've actually seen happen in highly successful totalitarian regimes like North Korea, you know, like where people have pictures of the great leader on the wall, and, you know, there's some crazy stories, like, you know, foreign doctor comes in who works on people and they haven't had access to healthcare, and then, you know, people get well and thank the great leader, even though it was basically something done completely without him, stuff like that. So I don't know. I'm not sure if Melissa and I do disagree, but I personally think that this is a further elaboration of that idea already alluded to, that the state must become the church. And what that is this kind of weird mean method of getting people to be happy despite themselves.
I mean, okay, can people hear me now? I don't even know. Okay, awesome. I think we do disagree, not entirely. I agree with that reading. I just don't think that reading goes far enough. Like, I don't think Yvonne's entire point is just about a society. Like I've said before, I think that or maybe I don't care what Yvonne's intent is. Whatever his intent, what this chapter offers to me is a really complex picture of the way that the desire for religious certainty ends up intersecting with our desire to give up freedom. And sometimes that might look like a totalitarian government, but sometimes it might look like the prosperity gospel and Trumpism, right? It's like people just want to give over their choice to something and know they have the right thing in front of them. And for some of us, it just looks like, I don't know, like my mom, who still, whenever I tell her something's going on, is like, well, I'm praying for you. I know God has a plan. Like, to me, this is so critiquing that sense of there being a clear plan and our desire for that and how that could make us give over our freedom. And so I guess I'm circling back to what I already said, which maybe people didn't hear, which is, I think part of that is just directly on, but I'm just more interested in taking Yvonne's ideas further and not just thinking about critiquing totalitarian states. What does it say about religion? Like, to me, if I say I'm at all sympathetic to the Grand Inquisitor, it's because I think he's onto something when he says we want miracles and we want mystery and we want, like, these answers handed to us. I think, like, to move past that too quickly and be like, oh, those stupid masses, is to, like, let ourselves off the hook and not see the ways that we want often to have those things answered for us. We want to know what the plan is.
That's where we disagree, and where I think it is important what Yvonne cares about. I'm just trying to sort out him as a character. You can read the chapter from a greater distance. You know, is this an author's critique of these various things? But my take and my assertion here is that Yvonne is in no way critiquing any of these things, but is actually saying this is the best possible thing we could imagine in light of the crappy situation we find ourselves. I see him as advocating this earnestly. So that's my read on Ivan. And feel free to disagree, but I don't think Ivan is critiquing. I think that the author might be critiquing, but Ivan personally, I don't think has a problem with the Grand Inquisitor.
Where are all of the people in between Jesus and the Grand Inquisitor, right? I kind of read that as maybe a criticism and a call to action to all of the people. I said that like an asshole, sorry. The people, the Grand Inquisitor and Jesus are talking about pawns, but why can't we accept the weight of freedom? Why is it that we only, as people, basically are dismissed entirely as we need to eat, and if you make decisions for us, we're all good? I wore my Star Trek shirt for this because I was reading it from that perspective, and I don't know why there's. When I read it, I felt like it was like, you must decide, all you people under the Grand Inquisitor or following Christ, everyone has a weight. And then when you choose, you're taking responsibility for everyone. And you can move past both of those things in that case.
I don't know. I think I've been waiting on the sidelines here for a while, so I'm gonna butt in here. I'm not sure that Ivan really actually has a specific leaning here. Like on one side in Rebellion, he's like railing against suffering, and then he presents this other view where it's like, well, we could eliminate suffering by control and limiting freedom, because freedom's really the cause of suffering, and why would you let that? But then all of a sudden, like, this Christ figure comes into his story, and the Christ figure is just silent and gives him a kiss, and then the Inquisitor lets him go. Like, it's kind of like this weird, like, I can't even understand, like, what's going on here. Like, where is Ivan? Is Ivan even, is he just like kind of thinking out loud here? Is he really actually sympathetic and really trying to like win over somebody like intellectually, or is he just stuck? And I'm kind of thinking he's just stuck. That's my take on this reading. I don't think he's like trying to do a huge point, and I think there's a huge amount of other stuff that's coming into play here, like the elder counterpoint. It's like he sees this other thing, and then like going back to our other discussion, what Micah brought up last time, where it's like, well, like Ivan and Alyosha are like different people with different experiences, and Alyosha has this like loving father figure, and Ivan has this hateful father figure, and he can't understand love, and like that's the whole point, that it gets derailed in Ivan's story, where love is finally brought into some sort of point and makes its entrance, and then it's like it almost devastates the Inquisitor in some way. So,
well, just to clarify, the Inquisitor does go ahead and burn him the next day, so there's that. But I think you made great points. I want to clarify my own point. I'm not sure totally sure whether Ivan is sympathetic. Is Ivan even Ivan? Sorry. I'm not sure if he's completely sympathetic with the totalitarian takeover of freedom for man's good, but I do think he's very earnest about. I really think he believes humans can't handle freedom, and this isn't like the fun, positive existentialist spin where therefore go out and do good and create, face that. And it's more like, I'm pretty sure Ivan is really, like Michael said, stuck and thinks freedom is part of the problem. Human nature is too weak to handle freedom, I think, is part of his point. I don't think it's a radical critique of religion or totalitarianism, because I don't think Ivan has any grounds for critiquing those things.
Okay, I guess maybe I'm not trying to double down and saying it's a critique. I'm just doing this thing I always do when I'm teaching any sort of argument in a class, which is like, before we dismiss the argument out of hand by saying, like, Ivan doesn't believe in God, or Ivan is talking about socialism, or Ivan didn't have a good father, like, do we fully understand what it is he's even saying? And, like, we still haven't even talked about, like, the 3 temptations that the Grand Inquisitor brings up and what those might symbolize and what those might represent. I mean, we've kind of, like, brushed past it. But I guess I'm just pushing is, like, it sounds weird because I'm not sympathetic to the Grand Inquisitor. I'm not like, yay, I would love to have some creepy old guy, like, take away my freedom and tell me what we should do. I'm just saying, I feel like, once again, Ivan has really diagnosed a problem that I think is real, and maybe he comes to a crazy conclusion, but I feel like it can be too comfortable to rush past, oh, he just has a messed up view of humanity. Like, when he's talking about that first temptation of the bread, I really feel like I was saying, to me, that symbolizes wanting certainty, wanting stability, wanting to feel like your life is going to be okay and not die in the streets, right? Like, I don't know. I guess I'm wanting to make sure we've really understood, because I think the Grand Inquisitor is laying out a really serious problem, which is we can talk all we want about freedom, but, like, actually, like, and this is where I was connecting it to existentialism, was I do think many of them wrestle with the idea that you look freedom in the face and it's scary, and you can either embrace it and kind of lean into it and, like McGee said, like, make meaning. And freak out. The idea of the Grand Inquisitor seems to be like, we'll just take that choice between having to make meaning and nihilism off the table. Yeah, so I'm not saying I totally buy that idea. I'm just saying, like, I want to. This is just always my impulse as an arguer, is to slow down and really, really understand the opposing point of view before I dismiss it, or, like, just say, nah, it's totally, because it's creepy. It is creepy, but I want to understand the point he's trying to get at.
I want to clarify immediately that you and I have the same goal there. And what I'm trying to do is say people too readily read this as an easy critique of things they don't like. I don't like organized religion. I don't like totalitarianism. I don't like communism. And Dostoevsky figured that all out and said, you know, this stuff sucks. I don't think that's an honest reading of Ivan. And I think he is bringing up the much bigger question of, can humans handle freedom, period? Big question. Whether God's involved or not, like, you know, so that's part, I'm trying to get to the same place you just articulated. So thank you for taking us there.
So, Chris, I wanted to try to clarify, where did you see that he's burned again? Like, is that later in the book or something, or is it in the story?
Michael, I cannot hear you. Can you move the microphone closer or something?
We'll try. He burns the prisoner? Like, where is that at?
Where's what at? I'm sorry, bad connection now.
Prisoner. Burns at the stake.
Oh, where did he burn him at the stake? Like,
yeah.
I'm not sure I can find the page, but
so on 262 is where I'm reading, and, like, this is what I take. Okay, I'll just read it here. So the Grand Inquisitor is talking to Christ. He goes and kisses him on the lips, and this is on 262. And that is the whole answer. The old man shudders. Something stirs at the corner of his mouth. He walks to the door, opens it, and says to him, "Go and do not come again. Do not come at all. Never, never." And he lets him out into the dark squares of the city. The prisoner goes away. So I'm not quite sure. I think that's like a 180 from the Grand Inquisitor to the prisoner, where the Grand Inquisitor intended to burn the prisoner at the stake the next day, but then he actually lets him go free.
You know, I think you've actually read this more closely and correctly than I have. So the part I'm thinking of is actually on 260, which is before that. So great catch there. Like on 260, he says, you know, he's talking about how he was in the wilderness too and ate locusts, and, you know, he tried this whole freedom approach. But I awoke and did not want to serve madness. I returned and joined the host of those who have corrected your deed. I love that phrase. What I'm telling you will come true, and our kingdom will be established. Tomorrow, I repeat, you will see this obedient flock, which at my first gesture will rush to heap hot coals around your stake, at which I shall burn you for having come to interfere with us. For if anyone has ever deserved our stake, it is you. Tomorrow I shall burn you. Dixie, I have spoken. You know, and that's what I was remembering, but you actually have caught an interesting point. It does seem like he actually lets him go and just like go away and don't come ever back. And the kiss burns in the heart of the old man, but he holds on to his former idea.
Right.
Good catch. Closer reading, nice.
So I think that's important in that it lends credence to the idea that Ivan has not made up his mind or doesn't feel like the Grand Inquisitor's solution is any kind of solution, because when the Grand Inquisitor is forced to lay out his beliefs for the first time out loud, and say them to Christ, even he can't stick all the way by it, and he feels the pull of presumably some kind of bad conscience. I also wanted to step back to getting away from sort of easy answers. I find this section really troubling because Dostoevsky kind of seems to demolish like the existential freedom, raw revolt stuff, 70 years before it gets written up all that compellingly. Because he talks about the idea that, like, sure, one of the instinctive reactions once you, like, what is it? Man will rebel. Man will try to exist in revolt. And that's a totally normal reaction. And then he's going to get tired, and then he's going to get despairing, and then he's going to come back to us. I think anyone trying to give the sort of existentialist response to this has to grapple with that. That, historically, people haven't had the ability to live in sort of this rah revolt mode for a long time. Once again, Ivan doesn't seem to present any solutions here. I don't know the solutions here. But the psychological depth here is really scary.
Yeah. I had a lot of connection issues there. I don't know if did everyone else hear what Jason said? Okay, good. I did hear enough. I wanted to lend some additional thoughts and credence to what you're saying on two different points. One is the idea that maybe Ivan hasn't made up his mind here. This comes from a later chapter, and I forget exactly where it is, but Ivan's, maybe it's when he's on the train or something to go to Moscow. He specifically thinks back to this conversation and thinks, like, I said so much gibberish and I wasn't able to express my real ideas, so it's like we get two chapters of him talking excitedly about big ideas, but he himself seems to think he hasn't really conveyed what he intended to. So, and he wasn't able to open up to Alyosha in the way he wanted to, which is interesting. And I forgot what my other point was, so someone else can chime in.
Well, I think that there's a common vein to a lot of these threads, and I think early on Melissa hit it right on the head when she talked about the seriousness of the question and how people very much want to have someone have the solution, to say, I'll give you my freedom and you'll take care of it. I can't speak about people in general, but I know that when I was 21 years old and I first went to a monastery and talked with the equivalent of an elder, which, partly inspired by this reading, it was entirely for that reason. I wanted to find a Zosima who would tell me exactly what I needed to do and where I needed to go and everything else. And my own personal equivalent of Zosima in my life did this extraordinarily frustrating thing where he wouldn't do it. He would never do that thing where he would just tell me what to do and solve all my problems. It was all about helping someone else grow in freedom and helping someone else understand what the right thing is and not have to always be told what the right thing is. And the thing is the reason why it becomes a partial critique, it can be read as a critique of organized religion, it can be read as a critique of totalitarianism, it can be read as a critique against, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is because it's ultimately about the dynamic of three things: love, freedom, and power. And that's how that's the difference ultimately between Zosima and Ferapont. And I say that only from the reading we've done now. Zosima does not seek power over, as an elder, Zosima does not seek to have power over people. He wants to help them. I don't believe that from Ferapont. I think he would greatly enjoy power over other people. I think that when people seek power for its own sake, even if they think power is going to be the solution to the problem, right? If we can just, give the state all the power, then it'll be okay, because then we'll be able to fix everything because the power will be concentrated. To me, I just think the essential question that's being put about here is, are these things really the answer? Because Ivan is suggesting that power and miracles and bread, he's suggesting that these things, if they are actually applied, are the solution. And I think the whole point of the silent Christ is to say these three things are actually not the solution. And so, this is from the Chris Notes, is a thing that Dostoevsky would sometimes say, and I think it's very important, and I think it's deeper than all these other questions. It's just the fundamental idea of the contrast between love and power, and the idea that only love is worthy of love. And the idea that maybe power, regardless of who wields it, and the idea of subverting freedom and always and putting anything at the service of power, regardless of whether you're talking about an atheist state or religious state. And also the idea of, I think the other thing that needs to be mentioned if we're going to blame something, is that this is also a partly critique of rationalism, not just of religion or socialism, but the idea of trying to take love and real human feeling out of the equation, because it's only when you're taking human feeling out of the equation that you can justify burning 100 people. As Hitchens would say, you don't need you don't need God to make a bad man bad, but you do need God to make a good man do terrible things. And I think that's the thing that really needs to be looked at, is that the idea is that taking the heart out of it, whether it be a communist state, a religious state, it's by taking the heart out of it, and by taking freedom out of it, and by taking the essential dignity of the person out of it, because you view them as too pathetic. That's the underlying problem, regardless of which way, which institution, which way you want to point the blame. I think more than anything, I don't think Dostoevsky is going to ever criticize faith as much as he's going to criticize Western rationalism. That's just my take on it.
That is a really good answer. Thank you for saying that. That kind of solved the puzzle I had in my mind as I was thinking about this chapter. Yeah, and there's something ironic too when the Inquisitor is talking about his great love for mankind. For me, every time he says that, there's definitely a big dose of irony there. And also, there's that theme that we've seen. It's throughout the book of you love mankind. The more you love mankind, the less you actually love for real. Your neighbor, or your enemy, or the person who's actually right in front of you. So, the Grand Inquisitor doesn't actually love mankind at all, despite his constant overtures that he does, and he's doing this out of love, My thought, launching off of what you said.
I just want to be clear that, somebody said that they heard what I said and said the words awesome. I was like totally just plagiarizing Heron. So as much as I would love to be the recipient of your compliment, most of that was Heron. So just to be clear about that.
Noted.
Something that just now struck me in a different way about the significance of the silent Christ, because we brought it up a little bit, but I don't think we really delved into this whole. you know, how we've talked about how much we agree or disagree with the Grand Inquisitor, but the Jesus figure in this story doesn't say anything. And I had a point and I just lost it. Hang on a second. I think I had been thinking earlier that, you know, his not speaking was just to not get caught up in the arguments. But just now it struck me that maybe he doesn't say anything because, I don't know, because there isn't an answer. Like maybe the only real answer is no answer. And I feel like I had a better way to say that, but I completely lost it. So somebody else can jump in.
Ginny, can you repeat that last sentence? It sounded really good. Maybe the only answer is what?
Maybe the only answer is no answer, I think is what I said.
Cool. Thank you. I wanted to delve into the Christ figure in this poem a little bit, and turn the direction for a moment towards Alyosha's response to this whole thing. There's this interesting moment which I heard reflected a little bit in what Micah said way earlier in the conversation, about this being some sort of defense of God. Alyosha has this moment where he just sort of exclaims, "But doesn't this actually praises Jesus." I'm not sure I understand what he means by that. So I want to invite people to talk a little bit about Alyosha's response to this, which is initially, it's just sort of a whole lot of scattered thoughts, and he's clearly all worked up. Why is Alyosha so upset by this story? What is his response, and what can he possibly mean by this whole story actually praises Christ?
Well, speaking from my own initial reaction when I first read it, as someone who wept when he read it and completely agreed with Alyosha, I thought it was finally somebody kind of understood why, because who hasn't wanted to ask some of the same questions? Lord, why don't you show me the miracle just so I can believe you're real and not be in existential torment? Those things. But the idea that only love is worthy of love, the idea that God would value the verdict of the human heart and therefore would not bribe it, would not buy it, would not awe it, would not take it for power. The idea that it is because he truly loves us and respects our freedom, and that he would not therefore would only, that the only thing he would give to merit our love is his own love. And that can sound like a very cliche religious justification. But to me, especially when expressed by the only thing you say to the person who says he's going to burn you is you kiss him, I mean, to me, and maybe I'm just a sentimentalist, but to me, it just overwhelms me. It overwhelms me, the idea that someone could say, no, you're too good for me to buy. You're too good for me to awe. You're too good for me to force. The only thing I want from you is the free consent of your heart.
Sorry, we're having real technical difficulties on our end, so we're quiet a lot while we're figuring it out.
Yeah, I don't think that's a sentimentalist thing to say. I mean, that's kind of the gist I get from the chapter 2, is just this overwhelming image of the silence and the loving action of Christ. There's no easy answer. There's no argument. Like you said before, the critique of Western rationalism, there's not an argument to and fro. There's no debate. There's only the action of Christ, the action of God. which is a humble and loving action.
It's kind of strange in my take that this is coming from Ivan, the intellectualist person that has this image of this loving Christ, that when you get him in the hole or in the cell, you don't kill him, you let him go, like at the end, and like just that strange thing, like this hardened like person that in the Grand Inquisitor that loves humanity but still hates it at the same time. And right after he's talking about the rebellion and all the suffering and all this other stuff, and then Christ comes in, and then you're kind of like rejecting religion, but then like once the person that rejected religion like comes into this like experience of love, it's like it's silent. It just takes on all of it's been dealt, and hateful actions. It comes in, raises the dead, and then like it gets captured and thrown in prison, and they didn't immediately start torturing him or anything. I don't know if they did torture him in the story, but it's insinuated that is going to be the outcome. The response is that he kisses him in love, and like that's transformative, and that actually causes a change. Although it's not complete, but it's a change that it's like the love gets set free, or Christ gets set free in this, and it's kind of a very strange thing. As I said, it's like this is coming from Ivan, who, if we want to take him to like say like this is a huge critique of like religion, and like it's all false and there's nothing real, and I'm a genuine atheist, and there's no God and there's no love, and it's just suffering and power and control. Like I don't buy it. I don't think that's a good read. I think Ivan is conflicted on everything, and that's why Alyosha cries out like, "Well, this is just praising God. Like this is how it is. This is how I understand it to be." And like maybe this is a giant setup on the part of Dostoevsky for the reader to like read on further, to like find out like here's your teaser. Like you who think that like this is like the end result, and just wait, because it's going to all change here in a moment. Like the answer to suffering is not an answer. It's actually silence and presence.
Thank you so much for making that point, because I really was about to jump in and say, isn't it interesting for those who are saying maybe there's a defense or in praise of Jesus that this is coming from Ivan himself. He came up with the poem and the idea. There's a despairing way to read it too, of course, which would be more like the Shusaku Endo silence sort of thing, which is like, yeah, God's there, but he's not doing anything to get you out of your, unbearable situation.
What's kind of interesting though, like the counterpoint of power here. Here's the God, the Christ, right? And here's the Inquisitor that has all the power, the earthly power. And like Christ's power is manifested in his silence, and the Inquisitor like bows to it at the end in some sort of respect. Like
his silence and his love. Ultimately, it wasn't just the silence, but the kiss on the lips that got him. Looks like silence and love. Silence and a kiss on the lips.
In the context of Ivan's character, that was very interesting. It was also, as I was reading it, I was like, does he maybe think, he's into continental philosophy? Like, does he think what the Grand Inquisitor is saying is valid, given his education? And that's hard to the juxtaposition with like Christ being willing to silently suffer and then show mercy or grace is. I didn't know how to handle that juxtaposition between the two, in the context of his character.
Well, I think it's an interesting contrast between, again, pointing out that Ivan is often seen as coming at things from a very rational standpoint, and I think maybe part of what I was sort of trying to get at, my brain's like, I feel like dancing around a point that I can't quite get at tonight. But I think maybe part of it is that the contrast between these rational arguments is not just the silence, like you can't make a rational argument, but maybe the whole point is you have to then turn to emotion not just emotion, but experience. And I think that, you know, if these rational arguments fail, then there's something in that kiss, in that experience of love, that's very powerful.
I really like what you guys are doing with this, and I think we're getting a deeper understanding of this chapter. I'm inclined to revise my position to say I think this chapter shows a very conflicted Ivan who's exploring different ideas. And just like earlier when Zosima kind of said, you're either like the most to be pitied or the most happy man or whatever. It seems like here this is partly a thought experiment with different ideas, and there's certainly things where he's making a critique or he's sympathetic to these ideas and he's upset at God, but there's this other side he's sort of hanging on to, like maybe. We had the point earlier before they began the discussion. He says to Alyosha, maybe I want to be healed by you. And then we get the fact later in these chapters that he doesn't feel like he's expressed himself authentically, and you kind of wonder, did he get too caught up in his what was the more earnest expression going to be? Was it going to be a more self-disclosing, you know, confession of the inner conflict? And these were just, you know, arguments sort of covering over a wound, and I don't know, but I like the insights we're getting into the different directions Ivan's mind is going, and how contrasting they can possibly be.
McG, may I ask a question?
No, that's what someone has to say. It's supposed to be you, Michael. Yes, please.
You let me down, Taggy. No, so, you know, we both read this a lot of times, but when you read it more than once, sometimes you just want to hurry up and get to the part where the Inquisitor starts talking in the dark room. But there was something that struck me this time that I don't think I'd ever considered before. And that is that Christ performs a couple of miracles before he's arrested. And I just thought, you know, don't we need to think about that a little bit? That doesn't he like heal a blind man, raises a girl from the dead before the Inquisitor arrests him? And I feel like there's something going on there, because you would think that would, because you would think that there is something that's being communicated in that, and that there's a contradiction to where at one point he's talking about, well, there's a refusal to do miracles. But at the same time, he just had done a few miracles. And because there were people present and there were witnesses, that's how the Inquisitor knows for certain who he's talking to. Right? This is not just somebody who's a charlatan. The assumption is the Inquisitor is 100% convinced it is actually Christ in front of him and he's having this conversation. I don't know. I feel like there's something to that, right? Because, and I don't know what it is, but I feel like it can't be ignored. The fact that this is not a God who has not performed a recent miracle within the Inquisitor's purview.
Yeah, that's definitely especially interesting in light of his, his reading of these three temptations of Christ, and the first one is supposed to be miracle, which he says you've rejected. So it's definitely worth bringing that. That's a juxtaposition for sure. Like,
well, and I think
miracle.
I think in the past we've talked about, they had in their various debates, and I can't remember if this came up in the elders' quarters or over the cognac, but about whether miracles would even affect belief, right? And I feel like we had a long discussion at one point about that. So I think that's a great callback right there. So well spotted, Micah. I also think, like,
Taggy.
The other connection I wanted to make that I never, like you, I've read this so many times. This is like, I don't know how many times I've read this section, and I'd never before noticed that there's moments where the Grand Inquisitor sounds a lot like Smerdyakov in that time when he's talking about the why it would be okay to recant your faith if you're ever tortured. Because he's talking about basically how humanity is so weak that anyone in that situation would come to doubt. I don't know. That just really struck me too, that there seems to be some thread that's being woven together there where Smerdyakov is like playing out this idea of it's okay to give up your faith or to believe a lie or to do any of these things. And the Grand Inquisitor is basically saying, cool, I'll save you from that. Like, you won't have to worry about making that choice anymore if you come with me, guys. So it seems like there's some parallel or connection. Yeah.
Yeah, and Fyodor accuses Smerdyakov of being a Jesuit, casuist, but the Grand Inquisitor literally is a Jesuit. So there's that element as well. That might be surfacey, but yeah, definitely to highlight the parallel even more. There's that. So.
Yeah, Melissa's totally right. I know there are a lot of
I want
papers
to-
written about it, but I haven't read them. So, but yeah, there are like a bunch of papers on that. Sorry. Lag.
Yes, Chris, what do you want to do? Is Chris frozen?
I think he's frozen.
Oh, okay.
If you click on his face, it's going.
Yeah, McG seems to be frozen. He can't hear anything that's happening right now. He's yelling down the hall at me. Oh, Aaron's on his, mulatto phone or whatever it's called. What's
Muted.
it called,
Melodica.
Aaron?
Melodica.
Melodica. I like mulatto phone. That's what I'm going to call it.
All right. Well, I missed all the last points, but I'm back.
We just talked about Aaron's melodica.
I got that part. I don't know how that came up. Anyway, hopefully not because someone was saying something really boring.
No one was saying anything. We were waiting for you.
Oh, well, great. I thought Micah was trying to make a point and was speaking.
He was.
All right. Well, anyway,
You were trying to say something, and then we were waiting for you to start speaking again, but your icon was frozen.
all right, let's just move on and I'll say what I was going to say,
Okay.
which is I want to invite anyone to bring any other sort of questions for the group about this chapter or raise any parts we haven't talked about. I don't want to be the only one that supplies that. And then we got to move on because there's other chapters to talk about still. But I want to make sure we do full justice because this is a big one. Melissa raised, for instance, the point that we haven't actually discussed the three temptations of Christ, which is a pretty interesting section. Does anyone want to propose some questions to the group before we move away from this section?
Okay. I was just curious what people thought of Ivan calling Alyosha a plagiarist at the end. I thought that I don't know. I felt like that was an incredible term of endearment, even though, I don't know. I was curious what people thought about that moment.
It was heartwarming. One opinion. Okay.
Melissa's cackling. I don't know. I want to know what that's about.
I don't know. It was just funny when Aaron said it was heartwarming. And coming from another college professor, whenever someone calls plagiarism heartwarming, I cackle. I don't know.
All right.
Melissa gets me.
Melissa's tired.
He wasn't plagiarizing a paper. He was imitating Christ in the story by kissing him.
Yeah, which is a total.
Yeah,
Rip-off.
imitatio Christ. I can't do Latin.
Oh, imitatio Christi. Yeah, Yeah, I think it actually ties to an interesting point, which is after this whole thing, where does Ivan end up? He's just sort of belched forth this bizarre myth story. And then they have a kind of interesting conversation after that that's a little more earnest, you know. And the connection here is that ultimately, this is something Melissa brought up in the car, I think, today, was ultimately Ivan basically says, all right, well, I'm in despair and I'm planning to dash the cup at 30, but before I do that, I'll check in with you and let's just see how life has gone, and maybe I'll have one last chance to change my mind, you know?
Yeah, I brought that up in the car. Y'all wish that you could drive around, like going to church and doing errands with us. It gets deep in the car. But yeah, I really thought that was an interesting point. To me, it was like, that was one of the reasons I think Ivan is in earnest. Like, and that's how it circles back to rebellion, is he seems in despair. He's searching for a reason. I felt like this chapter, I feel like last time McG asked, what does dash the cup mean? Does it mean just given to your sensualist life? To me, this chapter reinforced the reading that Ivan's really thinking of just ending it all in some way when he hits 30. And to me, the fact that he's lost is underlined by him saying, well, okay, I love you so much, Alyosha. And I think this ties in with things that I know both Taggy and Micah have said about, like, you just need some figure of hope you can believe in. That he's like, I see something in you, Alyosha, that is good enough and loving enough that before I dash the cup, before I kill myself or just like become a total dissolute waste, I'm going to come check in with you one more time because I want to, you know what I mean? Like, there seems to be some connection that it's like, even though his ideas aren't saving him, he's not going to totally give up without checking in with Alyosha again. And that seems significant.
And I also think it's a great piece of wisdom, like a great moment of I want some other word other than wisdom. It's not coming to me. But to say that, like, right now, this is the way I see the world, or these are the questions I have, and these are the problems, and this is the despair and the suffering of children, and nothing can ever be right. And I know that for sure. There is no answer. But, you know, maybe in 5 or 10 years, I might see things differently. And I think there's a real maturity in recognizing that things you're sure about, you might not be sure about later.
Yeah.
Well, I take that to say, like, he's not sure. He wants to be sure. He wants to have that certainty, but he doesn't have it. And he's just kind of putting all these pieces together. And this is his whole relation with Alyosha. Is like, I'm throwing things out there, but I don't know if I even believe in half this stuff or what I actually believe in. But, like, this is kind of where I'm at. So just, like, a little bit more authentic, I think. And it's not trying to, like, be a criticism. It's just like, this is how I see it.
There's this interesting conversation that happens here about the Karamazov force that can sustain you through anything, you know, even if everything's complete garbage, human nature is bullshit, like God hates you and whatever, there's always the Karamazov force. And that's a pretty interesting little section there. And I think it's very interesting that Ivan has made up his mind that that's good until 30 or whatever. Although I will say, just on the nuance of what does he mean by dashing the cup? I'm still not sure at all that he means kill himself, because you know, he says there's a force that will endure everything. What force? The Karamazov force, the force of the Karamazov baseness. And Alyosha says, to drown in depravity, to stifle your soul with corruption, is that it? And he says, that too, perhaps, only until my 30th year, maybe I'll escape it. And then, so I'm not sure what he means. Is it like at 30 is the point that dashing the cup means giving in completely to all the baseness? Up until then, you've been sustained by the poetic sticky little leaves and are basically good and in love and joyful. And then it's just like, now let me have some drinks and get, you know, lecherous. I'm not sure which way to take that, but anyway, I think this is a pretty interesting conversation after he's gone through his whole, here's my objections to God, here's this Grand Inquisitor thing, and then when it comes down to it, there's I'm in despair, and but there's still the blue sky and the woman you love, and I'm good till 30 because of the Karamazov force.
I think it's more. I don't think it's suicide. I don't think he's like planning to kill himself. I think it's just like, I'm just like completely despairing right now, but I'm willing to like kind of stick with this if there's going to be some sort of resolution until I'm 30, and then I'm just gonna like just give in completely and just go wherever like this, like his dad or whatever it was. It's like just given to the baseness and corruption and all this other stuff. That's kind of my reading. Like this cup, like it's kind of like this cup of suffering or something like that he's bearing. He'll drink from that cup of suffering until he's 30, and then he's just done. That's my view.
I didn't know what to make of that little section where he says there's a force that will endure everything. It's the Karamazov force. And he says, I'll escape it maybe until my 30th year. And then Alyosha says, well, how will you escape it? And he says, again, in Karamazov fashion. And I'm not sure what he meant by that, but the next thing is Alyosha's like, what do you mean? Everything is permitted? And that seems to be a little bit of a sore point when he brings that up. Ivan's a little caught off guard by that comment, it seems. And he emphasizes that he does not renounce that point. And in fact, he almost challenges his brother. He's like, look, I'm not giving that idea up. And are you going to reject me for that? Like, he gives him a real chance to sort of denounce him for that. And is that when that's when the literary theft happens. But yeah, I don't know. Ivan's still a mystery to me. I find this whole chapter to be a riddle.
I think there's something else with Ivan hoping that maybe in, however many years or so, he wants to check in with Alyosha. Because I think there's something else going on here, which is Alyosha doesn't know how to respond or talk to Ivan, and he doesn't really have a way of, really able to relate to what's going on. But I think that this is also part of the reason why Alyosha has to go out in the world. I mean, what if Ivan could trust Zosima the way he could trust Alyosha? What if he could really share his heart with Zosima the way he could share his heart with Alyosha? Zosima is a lot wiser than Alyosha. And I think that even though Zosima may not be able to he may not be able to tell Ivan why love is right, he certainly can help Ivan understand why power is wrong. You know what I mean? Like, he's like, I can't tell you, if you want me to give you an answer, I can't, but you know for yourself from your own experience that none of these other things are satisfying you. I feel like maybe he hopes that Alyosha, who seems to understand something he doesn't, or know something he maybe doesn't, that maybe if it is true that Alyosha is the wise one and he's the fool, but Ivan doesn't know, he thinks maybe he's the wise one and Alyosha is the fool. But maybe if indeed Alyosha is the wise one and he's the fool, maybe someday in some years' time, Alyosha will be able to help him see what he can't see now. I think there's also a possible hint of that.
All right, I'm making last call for Grand Inquisitor comments with a special nod to David, who's been silent. You got anything on this chapter?
This is kind of an aside. I've been enjoying all of these comments. The weird thing that jumped out to me was just the comment of, I'll come back for your opinion, even if I have to come all the way from America. And I wasn't sure what the idea of America was to Dostoevsky at the time. It was the time of, I don't know, Thoreau maybe. maybe it was just like this far off place that would seem like an extreme place to come back from. But I didn't know if, I don't know, it just seemed a little just a weird piece of that conversation at the end. That I was just curious what that side comment about America would be all about.
David, you always have the most like slantwise response to what we've been talking about. I think America just represents sort of as far as you can get in the most difficult place to travel from. America will come up again in the book later, and I won't give anything away there, but maybe that will help throw some light on that. But I think it just represents like, you know, Ivan wants to go see the world, wants to sort of live it up until he's 30, and maybe he'll end up that far away. Maybe that's part of his dream, is to go be in a different. I don't know. I don't think it's a highly significant point. I think it's just what it shows is this extreme commitment, no matter what it takes, to coming back to meet with Alyosha, because that would take, I don't know, 3 to 6 months or something, probably.
Yeah.
To get
I
there.
do have to throw out, just because I have this kind of dorky knowledge, that Thoreau's been dead for about 10, 15 years at this point, and the U.S. economy is about to completely collapse in one of its many collapses. So, America, I got knowledge about that 19th century.
Booming bus cycles, baby.
All right.
Aaron, you understand me.
This is the last call for Grand Inquisitor comments, questions, and then we're going to talk about the other chapters.
I had a thought about somebody, it might have been you, Chris, raised the question about like, well, okay, so Christ does these great miracles, and then the Grand Inquisitor is demanding miracles, but I thought they're two very different kind of miracles. You know, the Grand Inquisitor expresses his love for mankind, and the miracle he wants is, you know, turn the stones into bread. That's very useful for everybody, you know, feed everybody. Whereas the miracles that Jesus does is, I think he heals somebody, doesn't he? Does he heal a blind person or something? And then he also raises a girl from the dead, which isn't particularly useful to anybody except those individual people, you know? So there's kind of the miracle that's for the common good, turn the stones into bread. That's good for everyone, and you can use that to take power, you know, everyone will come bow before you now that you can, you know, give them all this food. Whereas, you know, the raising of the dead and the, you know, healing of, I forget what it was, just healing of a blind person, let's say, is, you know, that's not particularly useful. It's extravagant. It's kind of, you know, beautiful, but unnecessary to everyone else, except for to, you know, increase their faith, you know, but it doesn't feed them or anything like that. So I thought it was just two very different kinds of miracles.
And the conclusion we can draw from that is, if you have pizza, you have total power and authority over college students.
Right.
Especially if you can make them from rocks.
I'm actually like making homemade pizza rolls like right as you said that.
Okay, if no one objects, we'll go ahead and move on to the other two chapters that we have to talk about. Is everyone okay with that?
Yay!
Okay,
Absolutely.
so
Please don't take my leaving the conversation as an objection, but bedtime for me.
thanks for joining, Jason. Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
I didn't-
Jason.
I didn't read the next two chapters, so I'm going to peace out as well.
Cool.
Bye,
Talk to you guys next week.
Brendan.
Bye-bye.
I keep waving and then realizing no one can see me, so that's unfortunate.
So I think it's kind of it's like a shocking juxtaposition to move from these two incredibly philosophical chapters concerned with the biggest ideas possible, and then see Ivan living out daily life with Smerdyakov. And we've already remarked about how these two characters have certain things in common. Let's talk about chapter 6, a rather obscure one for the moment. We have this kind of really bizarre, cryptic conversation that I hope you guys found as highly painful as I do. I think Dostoevsky does a great job here of making Smerdyakov absolutely infuriating, like to try and figure out what he's saying. And I'm right there with Ivan. Like, this guy is just unbearably annoying. But they have this whole cryptic interchange. I'd like to invite comments about this chapter, particularly from those who are reading the book for the first time. What do you make of this weird conversation between Ivan and Smerdyakov? Especially after all the stuff we just had.
Yeah, I couldn't tell if like Ivan was like flying off his handle, and like the last person on Earth he wants to see is Smerdyakov when he walks in there, because he's like so like kind of annoying anyway. And this just like took it to this one took it to 11. Like I can't handle you, and you're more annoying than usual. And then you're gonna say all this random ass crap, and like I can't take this. Like yeah. That's kind of my reading the first time around. I didn't reread this chapter, but that's kind of what was that.
Yeah, for me reading this for the first time, mostly my reaction was confusion. I mean, not only is Smerdyakov being annoying, but he, as you said, cryptic. Like, I couldn't tell what he was trying to get at or what point he was trying to make, or I don't know. Mostly I was confused, so I'm not sure if I have much helpful to say.
I thought both characters were annoying. I didn't limit it to Smerdyakov. I thought Ivan was like unnecessarily short-tempered and like, how dare you be familiar with me, boy? Like chill out, man.
Yeah,
I thought Smerdyakov was annoying, but I felt like Ivan was like pretty ready to throw a punch. It was like, dude, like it's okay.
That's, I think, part of the really interesting contrast between the chapters we just read, where Ivan is concerned for the well-being of mankind and upset about a God who, allows injustice, suffering, but the very next thing he does is come home and be like, my God, I can't live with or stand my dad or this idiot lackey of his. Like, I just hate people. Like, go away. I'm going to my room,
Introvert problems.
I mean, he does live with some grade A jerks.
That is true.
I mean, I think you're right. I think that's a deliberate contrast and an important one. But it almost kind of reinforces some of the Grand Inquisitor's ideas, right? It's like, who do we have for humanity? Okay, Smerdyakov and Fyodor. Great.
Who do we have for humanity is possibly the greatest question I've heard in my life. Who do we have for humanity?
It sounds like something that would be in an Avengers movie or something. I don't know.
Who do we have for humanity?
Wow, I'm glad I can deliver such good ones on this exhausted state.
One of the things I find very psychologically intriguing is how much Ivan hates Smerdyakov and how at the same time he can't leave. Like, for some reason, he's like, what I want to say is, get the hell out of my way and punch you in the face. What I do say is, how is father's health? When I sit down. And there's this like really intriguing interchange. What I love about this chapter, and it might be the only time this happens in the book, but like there's all these like fake subtext quotes like behind the scenes of like here's what's implied but not actually overtly stated. And you know, you can't be sure that that's the right reading, but it's kind of like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, also this. And Smerdyakov seems to be a sort of master of this almost manipulative mind game where you can't figure out what he's driving at. He's somehow in control of the conversation, but seeming like the subordinate. And it's just a really fascinating dynamic between the two, and why this irritates Ivan so much. You know, why does he get so riled up? And it seems to be because like Smerdyakov is too familiar. Ivan considers Smerdyakov beneath him. He doesn't really grasp his ideas, and he just hates being part of like Smerdyakov's like wink, wink, we know better than everyone else. You're in on my, you know, like, secret view of the world. We've got a little club that you're in. And he's like, I don't want to be part of your club. And that just irritates the hell out of him, you know?
I think we've all had that person to interact with before. I mean, that's relatable. I have, you know, students who like latch on are like, oh yeah, the other kids. I'm like, no, you're one of them too. Go away.
Micah, I think you're talking in parcel tongue.
Oh, sorry. I accidentally unmuted it. My bad.
I thought you were about to try to say something, but it was just little hisses coming through.
No, I'm sorry.
What do you make of this conversation about, I think I might have a falling spell, and the sort of weird thing that happens between them, where he's like, how can you predict that? And what are you driving at? You know, like all these bad things might happen. I suggest you go to Chermashnaya. Can
I jump in as someone with epilepsy?
Yeah.
Sometimes, you know, there are people have triggers that lower your seizure threshold. They're not things that you know for sure, but you know, 9 times out of 10, I have a partial seizure. I'm aware that one's in the vicinity.
Okay, so that's maybe not so unusual to have like a premonition that something this might be about to happen.
Yeah,
that's helpful. Because I think this chapter is very confusing, especially if it's your first time reading. You're like, what is going on here? Anyone have other questions or comments on rather obscure one?
What's with the name of the chapter? Anyone get any insight of that?
Did you say something, Michael?
Yes. Couldn't hear me?
Yeah.
What's with the name of the chapter? Does anyone have any insight to what that means?
I'm pretty sure the obscure one is Smerdyakov, who is speaking in these like riddles and weird, but gives you no clue what he's really driving at. I thought about that same question, and that's the conclusion I came to on reading it today. I don't know if everyone agrees, but all right, well, I'm the only one with an opinion, so it's obviously right.
Makes sense to me, actually.
Yeah, I'm still stuck in mostly being confused by this chapter, so
Is
I don't
Melissa
really have
talking?
an opinion on the title. Could you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I thought I heard Melissa talking in the other room, but her mic is muted.
Yeah, I was gonna say I mostly just am confused, but the bit about at the very end about however you pronounce that other town, Chermashna, yeah. When I read the next chapter, I was like, oh well, Smerdyakov obviously knows about Fyodor's dealings, so like that part of that cryptic conversation made sense after the next chapter.
Let's go ahead and talk about the next chapter. So this is Ivan, you know, comes home. His dad really wants to talk to him. He's like, not now, bye, go into the room. And he seems to go through this. It's really cool to get this omniscient narrator insight into what's going on in his head for a minute, because he seems to be going through this kind of complex series of emotions, one of which is this really lightheartedness, like I'm finally free and I'm leaving this place and I ditched that girl and I'm out of here, you know, and life is waiting for me. But he also has this weird uneasiness. And then he's doing this weird kid thing of sneaking out on the stair to listen to what his dad is doing. And then he sees that as somehow really loathsome. So there's kind of complex emotions going on with Ivan here. Do you guys have a sense of where he's coming from and why this cascade of, you know, intense emotions here?
I just will say I'm being quiet because these are chapters that are hard for me to talk about as someone who has read the book without getting into later events.
Yeah, we pretty much need first-time reactions on this stuff.
It feels like there's some foreshadowing, and then the escapism of Ivan. You know, part of his, I didn't know. Are they building tension? You know, he's anticipating something's going to happen to Fyodor or to Smerdyakov, or to Grigory or whatever, and then, yeah, just totally cutting and running and abandoning what his dad's asked him to do and moving on with his plan to go to Moscow immediately. I haven't read the book yet. I don't know what happens next, but it felt like a mix of anticipation and escapism.
I like the cut and run analysis, which in this family context, I think is completely intelligible. Like, enough chaos, I'm out of here. Like, and feeling very lighthearted and lifted about that, like, sense of freedom of, you know, I've been here for this pursuit of Katerina, and she was tormenting my heart, and I basically put my foot down and said, I'm done with that. I've been tolerating my father, who's just an imbecile this whole time, and now I get to leave him. And yeah, I would get the hell out of there. I know, like, that's the cut and run and escape as the introvert is definitely my defense mechanism. So
we call that a buffer zone.
Yeah.
One needs a buffer zone.
One thing that I found this chapter really highly amusing, almost as much as Over the Cognac or some of the earlier chapters of the Fyodor. And it's a little more subtle here, but I think it's pretty fascinating and entertaining to think about. Your dad just found out it's your last day in the house and you've suddenly announced that you're leaving. And he's like, but can you stop in Chermashnia on your way? Like, and he makes this whole big deal and gets really excited about this business deal. And like he completely fails to grasp any sort of familial relationship or love. Like, it's like, oh, you're leaving? Well, can you make a pit stop for me? Because I need to sell lumber. And like, here's all the ways you need to know how to read this guy. I found that really entertaining and kind of funny and tragic at the same time. It's like that's, and to hear Fyodor say he's desperately in need of money when it's like he already has 100,000 rubles to his name, and this is the difference of 3,000 possibly on a deal where he's going to make either way. I think this chapter just completely reinforces how shitty of a father Fyodor is, and sort of cements Ivan's hatred for him in a way like, let's just stop pretending that we have any real relationship and I'm just out of here.
Well, I think you see that in this route where he changes his mind on the way too. I was like, well, I was actually kind of thinking I might do it, but actually I'm not going to.
Yeah, and where McGee was talking about, you know, he finds out he's leaving and suddenly launches into this business deal. I mean, it literally says, the old man listened to the announcement that Ivan's leaving with no sign of surprise and quite indecently forgot to feel any grief at his boy's departure. Like, I sort of laughed at that sentence. Like, it's sad and terrible, but... Instead, he suddenly got into a great flutter, having just incidentally remembered some urgent business of his own. Like, he's just so self-centered. So incredibly self-centered. But, I mean, in a way, Ivan kind of is, too, being really self-centered. Like, oh, nope, going to my room and just focused on leaving. And then, like you say, deciding not to do the errand, the business deal for his father after all.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, my son's gone. Now back to wooing this woman. Like, she's definitely coming today.
Who's the smart person that he's talking to in this chapter? The intelligent man?
That's Smerdyakov talking to Ivan. And I'm not sure if, did he actually say that, or was that like
That's
one of the sort of implied thoughts? What?
That's the name of the chapter title, but
yeah, but it's actually a line of dialogue too.
Yeah, he says it on 279, Smerdyakov. So it's true what they say, that it's always interesting to talk with an intelligent man. And I didn't understand that statement at all.
Also, Fyodor does call him an intelligent man on 278. You're not a timber dealer, but you have a good eye. So he's getting called an intelligent man by several people who he's like furious with and doesn't want their regard. Like, wants nothing to do with them and kind of repudiates their praises of him, and particularly Smerdyakov. He's like, God, this guy is clinging to me for some reason, and I really hate it, you know?
it's kind of interesting that Smerdyakov does the exact same thing with that landowner's daughter, like previously. But
can you elaborate on that, Michael?
well, there was that whole like juxtaposition of like here's Smerdyakov who's like, well, if I go to Moscow, like everyone will love me there because like I won't be like the lackey anymore. I'll just be known for my intelligence. And like, here's this like landowner's daughter from the higher class. It's like looking at him and they're like, well, you're great. I love you a lot. And it's like, whatever, you're just some sort of crap. Like, that's not the stuff I like. And like, it's the exact same thing going on here with Ivan and Smerdyakov. But
Good catch. Shakespearean echoes, like lower class, higher class, happening on two different levels. Smeryakov spurns the girl that he thinks is simplistic and beneath him, and here's Ivan spurning Smeryakov, this simplistic lackey that with his cryptic remarks and just go away, you know. And interesting that Ivan is about to live the dream that Smeryakov hopes for, right? He's about to go travel Europe and the West and get to do all that stuff. And that's a very interesting connection, Michael.
I see so many connections between the major characters, like where they're like points and counterpoints and like playing off the exact same themes, and I'm sure everyone does too, but this is one of them.
What do you guys make of this sinking feeling that Ivan gets? He's like, he's escaped, he's on the train, he's right into Moscow, and then, you know, away with the past, here comes my whole future. But instead of delight, such darkness suddenly descended on his soul, and such grief gnawed at his heart as he had never known before in his whole life. He sat thinking all night. The train flew on, and only at daybreak, entering Moscow, did he suddenly come to, as it were. I'm a scoundrel, he whispered to himself.
He screwed his dad out of some timber futures. Bad son. That's the anticipation. I mean, it's certainly building to something. I mean, otherwise, a character who's exiting stage left wouldn't have to feel bad.
Like, is this Ivan being developed personally, like as a character or something? Like, he can see himself as a scoundrel? I don't know.
He's definitely. Go on, Jenny. Go on, Jenny.
I was just going to say, I think when I first read it, you know, earlier, I just figured it was because of not making the extra stop with the lumber lots, you know, like I didn't uphold what I said I would do for my father. Like, even though he's been a shitty father, I feel bad for being a shitty son. But now that we're bringing it up in larger context, I don't know. I'm thinking it might be on a much larger scale. You know, does he feel like a scoundrel for running away because he thinks something might happen back at home? Or I'm not really sure, but I'm starting to think it's less simplistic than I first read it.
Yeah, he's definitely cut all ties with his family and was like, I'm done with their problems. I'm going to go have my life. And, you know, is this a second thought? Is this just like, I said I would do something and I'm not, and I'm just, screw them. I'm going to have my own life. I'm done with these people. It's just, it's sort of striking. It's like, come on, Ivan, you're getting what you want for once. Can this guy ever be happy? Like, you know, what does that mean that he's so conflicted when he leaves and goes on, even though he's been miserable while he was there? I don't know.
He might feel responsible that his dad and his brother are fighting over a kept woman, and he's the responsible, rational one, and he's pieced out. All right, my voice of reason's gone. You guys have fun.
I think maybe what might be also important is to think that his conclusion that he's a scoundrel, it's not necessarily the result of him going over it in his mind, but just the feeling. Like, he gets a feeling and now he's a scoundrel. And I think that's important.
He's also reflecting on how he didn't, I can't remember quite where it happens, but how he didn't properly open up to Alyosha. And it's like, wow, two chapters of complete outpouring, and that wasn't the real thing. It's like, what was the real layer? I'm always curious. Like, I wish we would have gotten to see Ivan do the real layer, you know, because he kind of regrets that after the fact. like, what a bunch of gibberish I said, is, I think, his exact line. It's like, wow, the greatest, two most famous and profound chapters that everyone reads are just a bunch of gibberish.
Would that I could write such gibberish.
Does anyone have any other, let me stop.
Darkness and grief. I mean, like, why is that the cause of why he's calling himself a scoundrel? What is this darkness and grief that he's talking about? Because it's not like a scoundrel, like, well, you know, like I screwed over my dad, but that shouldn't be like darkness and grief. That should be like more or less a happy occasion. Like finally, I'm giving it to the old man who just like continually like screwed me over, you know, like. What is it? I think there's something deeper here. Like, what is it? Like, has he been awakened to something? Like he's trying to go to a new world, and like now he's kind of seeing a new world, something that he's never thought about before. I don't know. I think it's like a definite, like, huge foreshadowing or something. Like, but something's going on internally here.
Does anyone have any proposed topics that we haven't discussed in any of these chapters? I've run out of questions and don't want to be the only person setting the agenda. So anything else you want to talk about, or shall we call it a night?
I guess I just want to ask if anyone else feels terrified at Smirdyakov. I don't know why, but the more I read Smirdyakov, the more he terrifies me, even though he's not real. Like, I'm terrified by Smirdyakov.
I don't know about terrified. Definitely confused, and something seems off.
I've had more pity, but you know, off can be terrifying in the right context, I suppose.
He's definitely a totally pathetic character. You know, he's describing how he's stuck between two people who are, you know, just constantly hounding him for questions that he can't answer. Like, what's this lady going to do? I don't know, you know, threatened from both sides, completely trapped. And so there's this side you can relate to as someone that is caught in a bind between forces, like social forces out of his control. But there's this weird thing where he wants to have this connection with Yvonne, and all this wink wink stuff and implied subtexts that make you really not trust him and kind of be like, he's, I don't know, like uncomfortable. He's an uncomfortable person to be around.
Why
what are you
is
going to say, Michael?
terrifying?
I think I talked over you. Can you repeat that?
No, why do you say terrifying? I mean, what is terrifying? Just define your terrifying that you're trying to go for. Because I'll go with uncomfortable. Like, geez.
I guess maybe I shouldn't have said that, because I don't know. It's easy to read some of what's going on with Smirdyakov differently if you've read the whole book. So I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't have said that.
Well, I
get like some sort of weird insinuation, like he's trying to plot something like that. That was my read when he's like talking to Ivan, like, and here I am trying to like stage my alibi or something like that. Like I'm gonna like fall sick, and you're gonna be there so you can corroborate my story or something like that. That's kind of maybe the hidden subtext, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like. Kind of like I'm going to fill in my facts so that I have a good alibi or something. I don't know. Like, and I don't know why, but
there's something
maybe.
Creepy. Sorry.
Yeah, he's creepy.
Like, Yvonne has no idea what is he talking about. He like just can't figure out what is he talking about. What are you driving at? Like, seems like you're hinting at something, you know, but then you always cut it short. You always like leave off, but you're giving me these weird looks, and I'm like, what is wrong with you? It reminds me of just very uncomfortable people. Like, for those of you, oh gosh, I shouldn't even say this. Never mind. But I think we've all known someone who's like radically socially uncomfortable.
You were going to talk about me, weren't you?
And like is trying to get close to you, and you're like, "Ah, get away."
You didn't say no, Taggy.
Does anyone else have any proposed topics, or should we call it a night?
Nothing specific. I mean, I think it was Aaron who said earlier, like, these two chapters just seem to have a lot of foreshadowing. So not having read the rest of the book yet, I'm just sort of waiting for what's next.
It made me want to keep reading.
Yeah,
right.
for sure.
This is in between two, like, or between the different books too. So like it's between 5 and 6 here. So we can anticipate a couple months delay before it's published.
Right. Yes. This is the cliffhanger in the serial novel that's being published bit by bit. So definitely he's got you wanting to read the next book.
Something's going to happen here. Like we need to.
I think it's really interesting to contrast Yvonne's kind of initial rapturous freedom and then subsequent fall into some sort of inner darkness with Fyodor's like sort of unrepentant nonchalance at his son leaving, and then sitting there thinking, for whatever reason, he's become absolutely convinced Grushenka is going to come today, and like all his dreams will come true. And that's how the chapter ends, is like Fyodor is sitting there like completely blissful.
I think it's really interesting what you just said, but maybe didn't realize you just said it, that like when Ivan gets freedom, then he goes into despair.
You can't handle the freedom.
Well, I was also going to throw in there a few minutes ago that, I mean, I don't know about the darkness on his soul and grief at his heart, but I mean, some of the unease of leaving could just be fear of change. I mean, everybody's scared of change on some level, and I'm certain it's wrapped up in a lot of other things, but we didn't throw out there yet just the fact that change is scary, and he's changing his whole life.
Yeah, and to bolster that point, there was something that I thought was a nice touch in this chapter where he's reflecting back on how he blew off Katerina the other day and kind of spoke this great breakup speech and walked out looking like an awesome, you know, like, you've tormented me and I'm done with you. But there's this moment where he's like talking about his sort of brave, proud words of a boy or something the other day, and he's like not so sure about that either. Like, so that's part of it too, is like he did just dump his love, and like he did it in the whole like emotional gotta reject you and go away, but I think he's sitting there thinking like, how easy is this actually now that I'm really doing it, you know?
Well, it's like almost like the evil things he has to do to get his own freedom, which makes him a scoundrel. I don't know if that's a proper reading, but in light of what we just discussed, it kind of almost makes a little bit more sense.
You said the evil things he needs to do to get his own freedom? Is that what it was?
Yeah, which makes him a scoundrel. And he's had a long time to think about it on his train ride, so.
It's at least worth pointing out, and this is like, I'm going way back here, but I remember like in one of our first weeks, we had a conversation about trains in Russia and did they exist and were they accessible? And he is riding the train to Moscow. So
it's got a long time.
It is in the book.
I'm so glad that was the arc you're like, I'm really going out on a limb here, and I was waiting for some crazy interpretation. I was just...
Choo choo.
They did have trains.
It made me laugh too, because earlier I was going to make a joke like, oh, when you're all talking about the cliffhanger, you're all just really wanting to know if Fyodor's going to get those timber futures, right? That's what we're all so worried about, right?
It was like 3 pages worth of descriptions on how to get this guy.
Yeah, if you want, and the art of scamming, that's basically how to make friends and influence people from Fyodor right here.
And if this were a Herman Melville novel or Victor Hugo, we would have a 50-page digression on like the equity of timber futures and their history in Russia.
And then I would probably love this novel even more, knowing me and the novels I love.
And that's just where I just have to point out all credit to Dostoevsky for writing a 19th century novel that's well-paced and gripping the whole way through without really boring divergences that get cut out into an abbreviated edition.
Okay, I'm just saying, you're saying that as a person with Masters of Divinity. Oh, there are definitely I'm gonna have this whole over the cognac fight about theology. It's just that you find theology interesting. I'm here for my boy Melville is what's happening right here. Yes, Melville, tell me about Wales. It's just as good as hearing about the Russian monks.
No, it's not, because these are colorful characters, not just an exposition.
I want to know about whale economies.
One's South Park, one's Family Guy. One is sort of tangential to the plot, one's absurdly off the cuff.
Aaron, have you read Moby Dick?
No,
I'm just saying you would love it. You'd be like, oh, you're going to tell me all about how whales are part of the economy? Yes, give me more.
All right. It's clear that it's time to transition to pure socialism. So we're going to wrap up this week's conversation. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I loved experiencing the Grand Inquisitor with other people because that's got a lot of layers. So we'll come back next week with a real radical shift in gear where we're going to focus on the life of Zosima, which is often seen as a contrast or counterpoint to the 2 chapters we just had about doubt and objection, and I don't know. It's really an interesting juxtaposition, and I think next week's book is just as important to the kind of philosophical core of the novel as the last 2 were. So I hope everybody joins. Really excited to talk about that one too. But for tonight, good night, everybody.